Back in October of last year, we pitted the RX 7800 XT from AMD against the RTX 4070 from Nvidia, and the results were pretty conclusive, with the 7800 XT being the better buy at both 1080 and 1440p, and by quite some margin too. But with the 4070 Super now released and offering up more performance to the tune of around 12% in terms of specs, is it enough to fend off AMD and provide better value for money overall? Well, that's what we're going to find out in a total of 42 games at 3 resolutions. But before we do, here's a quick word from this video's sponsor. Hello mate, you alright? Yeah, just got all the bits from my banging new gaming PC. Just got to put it together. It's going to be so much better than yours. Oh, right. What did you get then? The latest Intel 12th gen processor, a feature-packed motherboard, and 32 gig of DDR4 memory. See? Miles ahead of yours. You realise that board needs DDR5 memory, don't you? Don't tell me you went and bought the wrong stuff. DDR4 is so 2014. I can't believe you was that stupid. What? No, you're joking. What should I get then? For me, I'd be looking at Corsair's newest Vengeance DDR5 kits, or if you're wanting that all-important RGB, then go for the Dominator Platinum RGB. Oh, you are a lifesaver, thanks, but where can I find out more? By clicking the link in the description below, of course. You call me the stupid one. So the RTX 4070 Super is one of the new kids on the block that forms part of the new Super series of cards from Nvidia, with higher core counts, more performance, and in terms of the 4070 Super, the same $599 price tag. Now, considering when we put the RTX 4070 against the 7800 XT from AMD, Team Green ended up falling short when it came to bang for buck. So even with the same price tag, the extra performance should definitely help to bridge the gap, especially as AMD had a 24% lead over Nvidia in terms of cost per frame at 1440p. But with game and driver updates coming thick and fast, and Nvidia having the upper hand in terms of ray tracing, this could all change quite dramatically and bring the fight even closer to each other, especially as the 7800 XT comes in $100 cheaper than the 4070 Super at $499. So this should be a good one. So to get straight into it, we put both cards onto our GPU test bench consisting of an AMD Ryzen 7 7800X3D on a Gigabyte B650E Aorus Master with 32 gig of Corsair Vengeance RGB 6000MHz CL30 dual channel memory. All of our testing was done on Windows 11 with the latest updates applied and with the latest BIOS revision for the motherboard. The driver used was Nvidia's 555.15 driver and AMD's 24.1.1 driver, and we tested in 42 games in total, of which we'll be focusing on about 15 today, before jumping into the percentage differences of all 42 games. Now, we will be showing 1080, 1440 and 4K results today, but our focus really is going to be on 1080 and 1440p, as that's really where these cards are aimed at in the market. We'll also be looking at the cost per frame too, though as always, if you want to check out all of the charts for all of the games, they will be available to our Patreon supporters, where you get a ton of other cool exclusive benefits. The link for that is, as always, down below. So with that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. So kicking things off with a Plague Tale Requiem, and the 4070 Super is off to a good start, pushing out 11% more performance at 1080p. While that gap does narrow slightly at 1440p, though Nvidia still do hold the lead with a 4% margin. Though considering the 20% price disparity between the two cards, I'm actually going to chalk this up as a win for the AMD 7800 XT in terms of value for money. In Baldur's Gate 3, Nvidia still hold the upper hand in terms of performance with an 8% lead over AMD at 1080p and the same at 1440p. It's nice to see extra performance, but it does come at a cost, and that cost is $100 more for the latest GPU from Team Green, and I fear that's the trend that we're going to see in all of the games that we look at today. In Call of Duty, things take a bit of a nosedive for Nvidia, as at 1080p, the 4070 Super now sits 14% behind AMD's 7800 XT, and a smaller 12% behind at 1440p, which is quite a large gap considering the extra 20% price commitment needed to get the RTX 4070 Super, showing that AMD still are the value kings. But with so many games to test, that could all change. Cyberpunk sees the results draw much closer to each other, though AMD still come in a margin of error 2% better at 1080p and 6% better at 1440p, while 4K levels out, separated by just a single frame per second. At such high levels of performance and such small differences, it's unlikely that you'd actually notice the difference, but the numbers don't lie, and the AMD card is the better choice here. Enabling ray tracing is really where Nvidia come into their own within Cyberpunk, as the 7800 XT now falls a staggering 41% behind Nvidia, and starts teetering into the realms of unplayable frame rates. Sure, you can play Cyberpunk at 30 FPS, but it's the 1% lows where things can really make a difference. Moving up to 1440p, and again we see AMD falling behind Nvidia by 38% overall, though at the frame rates displayed, I'd be looking to enable upscaling just to boost those figures back up for a more enjoyable gaming experience overall. Looking at F123 being made by Codemasters and in conjunction with AMD, I'm not surprised that the 7800 XT comes in 18% faster at 1080p and a slightly healthier 20% faster at 1440p. Now at such a high frame rate, you're unlikely to notice any differences between the two GPUs, but as we're talking performance figures, AMD do come out on top. With ray tracing, as expected, we see Nvidia holding the lead by 9% at 1080p and a slightly higher 11% at 1440p, and with much stronger 1% low figures as well. Now considering F123 is typically AMD biased, this is a good result for Nvidia, who typically do have better ray tracing performance, but still fall short of the mark when factoring in the cost of buying each of the GPUs that we're looking at. Moving on to Far Cry 6, and again the game does favour AMD cards generally, and that's evident at 1080p and 1440p with a 7% margin in favour to the 7800 XT. Again, we are at high frame rates, which would be hard to notice, but a win is a win regardless. Again, as we enable ray tracing, AMD fall behind by 20% at 1080p, but the extra VRAM of the 7800 XT more than makes up for it at 1440p, where it only sits 4% behind, which is still a bit of a win for the red team considering they come in $100 cheaper at retail. So again, even with ray tracing, it's not looking great for Nvidia here. Moving on to Hogwarts Legacy, and Nvidia managed to hold the lead at 1080p, where we find the 7800 XT coming in 3% slower. But given the price difference and the fact that the cards are aimed at 1440p gaming, where both cards match in performance, it's a clear win to AMD yet again, and with dramatically stronger 1% lows too. Enabling ray tracing, and in case you hadn't guessed it, Nvidia come out on top, and by a decent margin, as the 7800 XT now sits 24% behind at just 54 FPS, compared to Nvidia's 71 FPS. At 1440p, the gap increases, now with AMD 31% behind, and showing that Nvidia really do have the upper hand when it comes to ray tracing technology. And though AMD have caught up slightly over the years, they still have a way to go. In Spider-Man Remastered, Nvidia managed to hold the lead during the pure rasterization tests, where AMD fall 11% behind at 1080p, 15% behind at 1440p, and 16% behind at 4K, which shows some pretty decent scaling from Nvidia as we move up in resolutions, and makes for a more viable argument for the extra cost involved when buying a 4070 Super. Turning ray tracing on sees similar margins, with AMD falling 16% behind at 1080p, 25% behind at 1440p, and 27% behind at 4K. So again, some good scaling, and at the 1440p resolution that these cards are aimed at, Nvidia are finally starting to look good for kind of what they're demanding in terms of price. Ratchet and Clank is an odd one, as it's always kind of seemed to favour AMD quite heavily, and especially in the 1% lows, where there's a huge 75% margin between the two cards, while the averages only give a 3% difference in favour to AMD. 1440p sees the cards trade places, but we're talking less than a 2% margin between them, so you could argue they are level. But again, AMD hold the better dips, as we've seen time and time again in this game. Switching ray tracing onto the very high settings, and Nvidia come through on top as expected, and the scaling across the resolutions is pretty strong too. At 1080p, AMD sit 28% behind, while as we move up in resolution, that becomes a 32% margin at 1440p and a whopping 77% at 4K, where you could argue that Nvidia is still more than playable, while AMD can barely get going. Lastly, in Starfield, the margins are much smaller, with Team Red falling 4% behind at 1080p and 1% behind at 1440p, so we're talking 1 to 4 FPS difference, which really isn't going to be noticeable, but what is hard to ignore is such close performance when the price is separated by $100. So when we looked at the RTX 4070 versus 7800 XT back in October, it wasn't great for the 4070, as that really did struggle with the price based on its performance, and while it's clear to see that the 4070 Super does do better, doesn't look like it's enough, unless you're specifically looking at ray tracing performance. I mean, $100 is $100, and while there are arguments you could make in regards to Nvidia's image quality versus AMD, or the fact that they have other functionality like path tracing at decent performance levels and DLSS 3 with frame generation, which is something that is definitely extra added value, they are both still in their infancy for most gamers. And while ray tracing has seen a huge uptake as of late, along with DLSS, some people still play titles that just won't harness ray tracing, path tracing, or upscaling. so that makes no sense for them to pay more for features that they just aren't going to use. Now, while we showed 16 different games today, some with ray tracing and some without, we actually have a much larger pool of results of 42 games, which will help give us a better understanding of how things look overall. And it's here at 1080p where the RTX 4070 Super comes in 13% faster overall, which is very clear to see why when the majority of the games involving ray tracing are positioned nearer the top, such as Doom Eternal at 76%, Cyberpunk at 69%, and the Callisto Protocol at 42%. In fact, Nvidia win every test when ray tracing is involved, though that was kind of expected anyway. AMD do have its wins in a small amount of games, with the biggest difference coming by the way of Red Dead Redemption 2, where the 4070 Super comes in 38% slower. With the lows, AMD definitely has the upper hand, as the RTX 4070 Super now comes in 12% slower overall, with Ratchet and Clank being the biggest point of contention, as we saw earlier, with a 47% difference in performance when compared to AMD. Again, there are some wins, but there are very few, with two of the titles coming by way of ray tracing, but it's not enough to fight off the 7800 XT in the bulk of our tests. Now, as we move up to 1440p, which is, I guess, where both of these cards are targeted towards, we find the 4070 Super coming in 11% faster overall. Again, as the chart shows, Nvidia really do hold the stronger position in terms of ray tracing, with the likes of Cyberpunk 2077, Callisto Protocol, Ratchet & Clank and Hogwarts all coming in above 45% higher overall. AMD does have its big win with Red Dead Redemption as the RTX 4070 drops lower, but this really is a bit of an outlier as the rest of the wins are by margins of 16% or lower. Though even if we remove that result, it doesn't really increase the overall standings by too much, and shows that even though Nvidia come in the faster of the two cards, it's also the most expensive. The lows at 1440p are pretty significant too and follow the same trends that we saw in the averages. The RT based games hold strong leads, especially in the likes of Cyberpunk, Hogwarts and the Callisto Protocol, which actually offer up 100% better 1% low figures at 1440p. Again, AMD has its wins here too, albeit on a smaller scale, where the RTX 4070 comes in 41% slower in Red Dead Redemption 2 and 23% slower in Ratchet & Clank, which very clearly favours AMD anyway. Now, though we've looked at the cost per frame on our day one reviews, it's worth taking a look at it again now that we've tested a lot more games that split between rasterization and ray tracing, as things should move a little bit. It's here where at 1080p the stand-ins haven't really changed from when we looked in the smaller selection of games, but instead the cost per frame has dropped, and that's down to the fact that we've got games like Doom Eternal, which garners absolutely huge frame rates, F1 as well. What that means is that the 7800 XT now sits at $2.96 per frame, which is 10% lower than the RTX 4070 Super, so a sizable difference in favour to Team Red. And also a point worth noting is that the RTX 4060 is sitting between those two cards, though we're talking about half the FPS when compared to the RTX 4070 Super, but would also save you $300. So really, I guess it comes down to your individual budget and what you're wanting to achieve. Now, as we move up to 1440p, the cost per frame does increase across the board as you'd expect, and the 4070 Super now becomes a bit more affordable when compared to the RTX 4060, but only by 2 cents per frame. While the more important comparison is with the 7800 XT, which now comes in 12% cheaper per frame, and with an overall average that's only about 5% less in terms of performance. So just above margin of error, you could argue, but still showing that the cheaper card from Team Red is the more affordable in terms of bang for buck. Now, one more area that I want to look at that you guys have asked for in a lot of our content is power and temperatures, because I guess when comparing one card to another, especially from different brands, it's an important metric. Having a lot more performance is great, but if the cost is physical in terms of power, that equates to higher electricity bills. That's one thing, and as a consequence, that could actually mean higher temperatures too. Now, when we look at the total board power across 19 titles, it's clear to see that AMD is much worse in terms of power draw, especially in some cases like Cyberpunk with ray tracing, where the 7800 XT uses 56% more power overall at 350 watts. Now remember, this is total board power and not TDP. And this is compared to Nvidia's 224 watts, so quite a big difference. While this is one of the biggest differences, Nvidia actually scoop up a win in every single game, and by quite large margins. Now, I will admit that this is a custom triple fan cooled card, but as AMD don't have a reference 7800 XT, it's all we had to hand for our tests, so we can't really blame Nvidia for that one. Now, moving over to temperatures, and it's a different story. So now that the triple fan cooler is working in AMD's favour, because the 7800 XT now comes in the cooler of the two cards in every single game. Not by the same margins as we saw in power consumption, but when we're talking up to 18 degrees in the likes of Baldur's Gate 3, that counts for quite a lot. Though it is at the extreme end, and we actually saw much smaller variances in other games, like 6 degrees in Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart with ray tracing enabled. So the margins are typically much smaller in temperatures. But as custom triple fan designed 4070 Supers are sort of now available, I guess we would actually likely see those gaps shrink even more, and possibly even in favour to Nvidia. So after the fact that we had already done a head-to-head on the 7800 XT against the 4070, and knowing that the small but welcomed extra performance on the Super would bring things more in line, I guess I already had an idea as to how things would be, so kind of knew what to expect going into this. The big question came down to how much extra performance, and if that could actually bridge that gap for Nvidia warranting an extra $100 for their card over the 7800 XT. And it's not, I guess, as clear cut as it first may seem. AMD, don't get me wrong, is the better choice in terms of value for money when it comes to pure rasterization. That's a given. And if you're on a strict budget, I can't really not recommend the 7800 XT, as it's shown time and time again that it has everything done right. But there's definitely more to it than that. Nvidia are the better selling brand. We all know that. And for multiple reasons. And that means that AMD are still, I guess, playing catch up. Not because they have an inferior product, but they are just a little bit behind in branding and technologies. It was clear to see today that even though the 7800 XT is catching up in ray tracing, Nvidia is still ahead. They've had, I guess, longer to perfect the technology and are working much closer with game developers to bring titles out that can harness the potential. Whereas AMD, with ray tracing and FSR and things like that, they're just taking more of a community-driven approach. And that's clear to see when you compare features of each brand. While we didn't look at upscaling today, DLSS is ahead in terms of both image quality and support for games, while AMD's FSR is again playing catch up. And while it's good, it's just not at the same level as Nvidia. But obviously that could all change when we see next generation GPUs. And that to me is where the extra cost goes. Today I wanted to see if paying 20% more for the Nvidia card was worth it over the AMD. And if we're talking just purely raw performance, then no, it's not. But when you start thinking about functionality in the feature set, that's a different story. And I'll probably end up getting called a shill for this, but I don't know, maybe it's something we'll look at in the near future, comparing features to features with performance to one side. So let me know if that's something you want to see before you start ranting that I'm saying this is the better card. I'm not. This is the better performing card, but I can see where the extra money goes. To sum things up, I don't think you'll be disappointed in either of these cards, dependent on your budget, but AMD will be the better buy straight out the gate, while Nvidia, with a little tweaking and if the game supports it, could actually be worth the extra money. Though I guess a lot of that comes down to the games you play, if they have ray tracing, and if they support upscaling, namely DLSS with frame generation. So yeah, that's gonna about do it for this one, I think. If hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, then a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do, then you can help support us over on Patreon, where you get a ton of exclusive benefits, including access to charts for all the games we tested, a super special area over on our Discord, bi-weekly game nights, meetups at the eTeknix offices, and much, much more. The link is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.